serious? Hey Reddit, what was your thank god I looked at the contract moment? My husband, then fiancé, was getting ready to buy a used car that's often used for street racing / rally racing. He doesn't do that, but it's a damn fun car to drive, and is pretty much sure to have aftermarket modifications if it's been owned by someone who used it for racing, or as a status symbol. My husband had done his research and neither of us were going to be taken for a ride, and even though this was the car we absolutely wanted, we were prepared to walk away. It was fairly low mileage. The dealer, a third-party outfit, not a brand dealership, kept swearing up and down that the car was still under manufacturer's warranty and had no aftermarket mods. I was skeptical. I knew that if the car had any aftermarket mods, the warranty would be void for that portion of the car, if not the whole thing, depending on the extent of the influence of the mods. I read every piece of paperwork they wanted my husband to sign and explained them to him, but I couldn't find anything that guaranteed that the car was still under manufacturer's warranty. So I straight up told him to walk away from the deal unless they gave us a piece of paper that both parties signed that said exactly that. They did it. Lo and behold, the car had an aftermarket downpipe, a really nice one that had been installed improperly. It was affecting the airflow through the engine and could have eventually caused permanent damage to the engine. It was going to cost us hundreds of dollars to either have it reinstalled properly or return the engine to its original, unmodified state, which would give us warranty compliance. Yay. But, surprise, as less, we had a piece of paper that gave us a hold on their balls. They tried to avoid us for a week or so until we left them a voicemail saying that if we didn't hear from them in 24 hours, they'd be hearing from our lawyer, and that's how we didn't pay for having the car restored to warranty specs. We even got to keep the downpipe. It's kinda spiffy. Edit. The car is a Mazda Speed 3. We bought a new RV and received a coupon for 3 free nights at a luxury RV campground park. Of course, to receive the free nights we had to sit down with salespeople trying to sell us a membership first. My ex was very gullible and gobbled up the free cookies and sales pitch after they showed us the beautiful photos of their campgrounds all over the state. There were many promises made of ocean views, clubhouses, swimming pools, etc. I was young, and he was definitely the one in charge at the time. So next thing I know, the 3 free nights turns into a full-blown membership with extremely pricey annual fees. But now we can camp anywhere anytime, right? We head out that weekend to the dedicated property for the free nights, and it's an absolute shithole. There is no ocean view, the pool is covered in scum, the clubhouse has the smell of mismanaged senior home with 3 residents staring at us oddly. Basically it's a gravel-lined trailer park for people who live in their RVs. I'm pissed. The kids are sad and trying to play on the rusty swing set. We bailed out that night after driving 3 hours, and the next morning he tried to cancel. They had told us we could cancel anytime. Yeah, right. After rereading the contract, this was a lifetime membership and you could not cancel it without following their exact fine print instructions of cancellation via certified mail written in the blood of your firstborn. It also had to be done within 48 hours of signing. These assholes send people away for 3 days to a dump, so when you come back you're contracted for life like a timeshare. Lucky for us, my beach fit got us home within 24 hours, wrote up their ridiculous demands for cancellation and booyard right out of there. Then they tried to not refund us despite it all, and I threatened them with litigation, so they finally did. I have a scathing Yelp review about them that gets regular votes for being useful and funny. They recently tried to get it removed and failed. Suck it, you dirty rotten leeches. Looked at renting a house about 7 years ago, and the homeowner had inserted some of her own clauses into the standard tenancy agreement. Now this is absolutely fine to do, but they were purposefully put into different sections of the document. So if you read the part detailing security deposit, you wouldn't see her additions as she put them in another area on the paperwork. One clause was that no footwear of any kind can be worn inside the property. Failure to adhere to this will mean the whole property's carpeting must be professionally cleaned. Another was the waiving of the mandatory notice period before the homeowner can come by and inspect the property. There's supposed to be a minimum amount of time they must give you notice-wise, before they can come over unless there is a serious property fault, leak etc. so that they can't just turn up unannounced. She wanted that waived so she could check we were treating her property right, and if we weren't then we'd be immediately evicted. I also caught her telling a relative that she registers eviction proceedings upon the start of the tenancy so she can evict them as soon as she decides they've broken her rules. There was a mandatory waiting period between commencement of eviction proceedings and being able to actually get enforcement officers to evict a tenant. Not sure of the current rules on this anymore, as I don't have as much to do with rental properties now. Noped out of that house really quickly and got a much bigger, cheaper house, albeit more of a death trap, a few streets away. Bit long, but satisfying, to me at least, was leasing with a big apartment company, where I had a garage along with my apartment. The lease contracts they cook up are 20+ pages long and naturally slanted heavily in their favor, and they use them as clubs against their tenants. Generally scummy behavior all around. They removed the restricted access gates because they were tired of maintaining them and kept advertising it anyway, etc. So the contract comes up for renewal, and they of course raise the rent on both the apartment and the garage, counting on inertia to keep me there, even though they're blatantly advertising a lower rate on the same model for new leases. Now at this point I'm planning on leaving in a year anyway to buy my house, so I swallow it and tell them to write up the contract for me to review. I sit down and read the thing and notice they've clearly left the garage fee off the contract, even though it's noted as being leased. I bite my tongue and read it over, and yes, according to the paperwork the sum total of everything was the price of just the apartment, and the total is less than what I paid the previous year. I sign it, fully expecting to hear back that they made a mistake before the property manager countersigns it. A few days later, I get my fully executed contract on my doorstep. Now the fun begins. I wait until the bill shows up on their payment website and call them up saying there seems to be some mistake. You're charging me $X when my lease is for $Y. Please correct. They tell me they'll review. A couple days later, they call to say, oh, it's just a mistake in the paperwork. You can either pay the full amount or we can take the garage off your lease. Oh, no. My contract clearly states the apartment and the garage is this price. Please correct your billing. I paid them the amount owed per the contract on the first point. Now come the threats. Eviction. Delinquent payment. Going to affect credit. Corporate lawyers. Luckily, I have prepaid legal services through my work. I call up the lawyer they refer me to and send off the contract. He calls me back the next day and says you're absolutely right. They don't have a leg to stand on here. Get their attorney to provide you in writing what they believe their legal basis is for demanding more than what's in the contract and I'll take care of it. My favorite line in contracts like this is how they clearly state that it is the entirety of the agreement, so there's no chance of slipping in things on either side. The property manager calls me to come visit her in the office the same day and says she reviewed it with their attorney and he believes they're in the right because of generally advertised pricing or some other such nonsense. She also implied that the person who wrote the contract was in danger of losing their job because of the issue, as if she wasn't more liable for it for signing off on it. This is where I get to tell her I've also retained legal services and passed on what he said. The look on her face was priceless. She told me she'd take it back to them. End of the story. I received a very terse note dropped on my doorstep a day later saying they've removed the extra charge from my account. I'm happily living in my new house for 4 years now, but that still gives me a warm glow when I remember it. Edit. I live in a high cost of living area, so that detached 1-car garage would have cost me $1,800 for the year. Not surprisingly, nobody was fired for the contract screw up. Okay, this is just a piece of advice, because I know there are actors out there who want to get into the business. I'm a talent agent and entertainment lawyer. I cannot tell you how many contracts I read that include things that are not enforceable by law or are just plain illegal, but actors are so happy to get an agent they sign without looking. Hire a ****ing lawyer. I used to charge $100 to read a contract. When I still did it, it's worth it. Example, I had a client, let's call her Jess. Jess is an incredible talent in voiceover. She to this day is one of my best clients. However, when Jess was first starting about 8 years ago, she signed a contract with an agency out of Kansas City. 2 years later she left the agency and we picked her up and showed her our contract. She raised her eyebrows at our rates, asking, how do you guys make anything with such low commission rates? This along with a few other things made me ask if she had a copy of her old contract for me to read. So here we go. First, it stated that the agency's commission rate, percentage of actor earnings they get, was 45%. The industry standard, if you're union, it can legally be no higher than 10%, and usually never goes higher than 15% even for new talent that non-union. Second, it stated a non-compete clause that lasted for 3 years and covered the entire U.S. and Canada. Not enforceable, and if I'm being honest, I could make a judge throw that out on a dime, but it would cost you a lot of money for me to do. Usually you don't find non-compete clauses in acting agencies other than a penalty for breaking your contract with us early, which in our agency we usually derive from an average of your earnings during the course of the current contract. Third, and this was a fun one, said that she could not deny appearing nude provided proper compensation. I was tempted to hammer this faking company after reading this. Jess was a very attractive woman, but that changes nothing. Let me be clear to all actors, you have every right to deny a job for any reason you choose. If your agency pushes you into something against your own choice, you call a lawyer or your union rep. If you have one point, there were about 5 other stupid things about ownership and her responsibilities, but those are the main ones. Nothing makes me more sick than agencies taking advantage of kids pursuing their dream. They are faking old age snake oil salesmen who only survive off the desperation of people who have dreams. Being an actor is tough and your agent is supposed to be on your side. It's an unwritten rule of the profession that, unless there are extreme circumstances, you hold the line with your client. That's literally the rules in my agency, and I've fired people for faking over actors for their own gain. I could go all day, but please, if you're ever in a situation as an actor or performer where there is a contract, just hire a lawyer to consult and have them read it. It doesn't cost much in the grand scale of what you could lose, and they will always help you, because if you're happy then you'll come back. If you need them, edit. You type one post without your coffee and Detective Reddit starts screaming from the rooftops. I fixed the post, you dicks. I attended this college in 2011 and was supposed to have received my diploma the following year, as it was a 9-month program. I never received it. I had moved, so I'm assuming that it was returned to sender when they sent it to my old address. They never called me about it either, as I couldn't attend grad at the time for personal reasons. I was interested in applying for university a bit later because I found out that the college I had gone to wasn't a recognized institution. So upon applying for university, they wanted the transcript from sketchy school. I went down there and told them I needed my diploma from there and that I never had received a copy in the first place. The receptionist was rude and checked the back only to tell me the original copy wasn't there and insisted that I needed to pay a fee of $35 to get it. I was pissed off because who the fuck charges a fee for a diploma you didn't receive? So I pay the $35, even though I thought it was bullshit. I really couldn't get over it after a while, so I rummaged through my documents I had signed when I first started the school program, and lo and behold, I found a line that said the first copy or original of the diploma is no charge, but that they do charge for additional copies. I'm fine with that additional copy part, but not for the original. I called their office and explained how I was charged for my first copy of my diploma that I never received, and also complained about how the receptionist treated me when I had tried to explain to her several times and nicely that I had never received my original copy. The person I spoke to found the original copy that I didn't receive. She was understanding and apologetic and said I could come back to get it and a refund. It was so satisfying coming back and seeing the pissy receptionist who basically had to admit she faked up. I realize she doesn't make the rules, but she really didn't have to be the way she was the first time around. I also know it's only $35, but I don't like being taken advantage of. Edit. Added paragraph breaks. A certain shady as fuck game publishing company offered to buy my RPG Maker game for $1,000 upfront, with no royalties or anything. I'd be basically signing away the game rights to them entirely. This didn't really seem like a bad idea at the time, since it took me less than a month to make the entire thing and I needed the money. However, in the contract, it also states that the publisher would be permitted to change the game in any way they saw fit without your consent. I was absolutely not cool with this. Plus, it turned out that they had given the exact same offer to dozens of other RPG Maker devs, some of which had only made glorified tech demos, and the publishers seemed really desperate and pushy to try and get me and as many other people as possible to sign. All of this combined caused me to decline the offer in the end. Said publishers would then send me several desperate emails encouraging me to take the offer, even after I made it firmly clear that I was not interested. Then, after I told my story on an RPG Maker forum and on Reddit about dealing with them, they made several legal threats against me and tried to blackmail me, which is why I'm not saying their name here. Anyway, some time passed after I finally managed to get the guy to fuck off, and I started seeing horror stories pop up on various websites about the kind of shit this company put these RPG Maker devs through, including, but not limited to, introducing glitches into games that didn't exist in the original data that was sent to the publisher. This includes at least one instance where the game would crash 100% of the time at a specific point because the publisher removed a music track and didn't erase the code that calls for that music track, adding typos and grammatical errors to dialogue that didn't exist in the original data that was sent to the publisher. Changing the plot of their game without the devs' consent, or without even informing them such a change was being made, which caused a plot hole in the sequel that the dev was in the middle of making the games easier by strengthening allies, weakening enemies and or introducing new items / equipment / skills that were overpowered. Also, apparently puzzles had been changed to make them easier to solve. According to the publisher, all of these things were done to make the games better and more accessible. Unfortunately, the devs really couldn't do anything about it, since they signed away all rights to the game for a measly $1,000. A bit of a different take on the question. TLDR, make others present you with proof you agreed to a contract before blindly accepting their assertion that you had one with them. My wife worked for a community college as a faculty assistant professor for the past 9 years. At the same time, she was working to complete her PhD and using the college's tuition reimbursement to assist with some of the fees. She decided to move on to a new position elsewhere and was told via email she would owe approximately $4,000 to reimburse the college for their tuition reimbursement payments. They informed her via email she needed to work there for 3 years after each payment in order to earn it. My wife asked to see where she had ever agreed to this in writing, and there was silence. No email response was received. On her official last day, she met with ours, and, at the end of the meeting, the ours rep admitted they had never followed any of their tuition reimbursement procedures with my wife, and none of the paperwork that was supposed to be completed, including informing my wife of the 3-year policy and her acceptance of it, had ever been presented to her. The ours rep said, "You'll receive an invoice for about $4,000 in the mail one day. What you do with it is up to you." So, this is really more of a thank God I asked them to present me with the contract moment than what was requested, but I think it's in the ballpark of what's being asked. A couple years ago my husband and I were looking to replace his car after an accident totaled it. We went to a dealership in New Orleans to test drive a specific car that we had checked out ahead of time. Even printed out the dealer's listing from their website so we could nail down the price we wanted. We got to the dealership and were immediately scooped up by their top man who had another sale going on at the same time. We handed him the listing and said it was the only one we wanted to see. He said sure and would have one of the training salespeople pull the car for us. The girl came and found us with the key. We checked it out and husband loved it. We got to the signing table and the price went from $13k to $16k. I asked to see the complete contract before we signed anything. It was the wrong freaking car. We were looking for a 2013 base model with less than 60k miles. They tried to sell us a 2010 luxury model with almost 230k miles. The top man came back just in time for the sale and tried to blame it all on the trainee. After a very heated discussion with top man about now taking our business elsewhere, since he tried to screw us, dealership owner graced us with his presence and said the one we were there to see was on loaner and they thought we would like this one better anyway. After even more arguing, we left and found a cheaper version of the luxury model in Little with only 80k miles for very near our price point. I finally have a story for one of these posts. Woohoo, doing my apprenticeship whilst at college. Was initially an 18-month course at college, not normal college, but 3 days on-site training at oil and gas training, and 2 days in college. Got to the final month and the training apprenticeship scheme company said they were changing the course and adding another 2 months on for additional courses for us to have additional qualifications. No worries, right? Good for us. Yeah, point. They kept saying they would bring in new contracts this week, brought in part of paperwork that stated we agreed to all terms and conditions in the new contract, but they somehow forgot the new contract. All my college mates were away to sign. I, being the smart one, told them to hold off until we read the contract. Managers tried to bullshit us saying that nothing changed etc point blah blah. I stood my ground, and they brought contract in 3 days later. I read it, and 3 new things had been added. 1. Any days off from now will constitute gross misconduct and you get flung off course straight away. 2. You agree to pay all training costs if you leave course at all during final 2 months. 3. They will not now guarantee you a job placement for the final 2 years of your apprenticeship offshore. No one signed. Refused to do any work. Had to get the CEO of company involved to change it back to original and to guarantee us all job placements for final 2 years. Thank God I read that, or about 40% of my class would have been thrown off for days off. When I was in high school, I bought some subwoofers for my car that came in a pre-made box. I was an idiot and didn't think to take into account the size of the box in addition to the 16-inch subwoofers when measuring my trunk to see if they would fit. Well, surprise surprise, they did not fit, and I had to take them back to Circuit City for a refund. I was in high school at the time and literally had just had a class a few weeks ago in which my teacher told us to always read a full contract before we sign it. Fortunately, that lecture resonated in my mind when they handed me a piece of paper at the return desk in order to process my return. It was a singular piece of paper, and on it, they said that by signing this paper, you agree to have a restocking fee deducted from your refund. I asked them how much the restocking fee would be, and they told me it would be something like $90, when the entire purchase was only $200. Christmas time sale. I told them to fuck off in a very polite way, and ended up selling them as well as my amp on Craigslist for only a very minor loss. Also, remember Western Sky Loans? They ceased operations in 2013 because they were charging exorbitant rates for loans, even by payday company standards. A $10,000 loan from that would end up costing you $62,000 in the long run. Always read the fine print, people. Always. I just got a job and quit less than an hour into my first shift. This resort, which caters to oil tycoon Texans and other obscenely rich people, had a job opening for a bartender. I'm on unemployment right now, so I figured I could make better money from rich people tipping me. I went to the interview and they asked me what position I was applying for, and I happily replied that I had applied for the bartending position. They said they had an opening in the kitchen and that they wanted me to do some shifts there. I told them that I had no kitchen experience and couldn't even handle the heat from being in a kitchen, and jokingly added that I'm the kind of guy that's more comfortable snowboarding in a t-shirt. Finished with I cannot work in a kitchen. They still hired me and told me my first shifts would be running bar back and food runner to learn the pose system. Pretty standard. I was fine with it, even if I made less tips for the first couple of days I showed up at my first shift, and they told me to go to the kitchen. What the fuck? I asked why I wasn't being trained on the pose, like I was told. They said everyone does everything around here. I looked at the schedule and asked why every serving and bartending position was filled by a young woman, and why none of those young women had a kitchen shift. I was told because they know how to serve and bartend. Faking, really? I have done bartending and customer service in faking San Francisco and San Diego. What more experience have they gained at a 10-person per day resort in rural New Mexico? So I asked if I was even hired as a bartender, and they said yes. I asked how many of my 5 shifts a week would be bartending shifts. They said I might get 1 bartending shift every 2 weeks. Asked, does the kitchen make tips? No. No, they do not. I walked downstairs and said I'm deciding not to work here. Thank God they were shady AF, and I'm pretty sure they tried to bring me on under the table. Didn't kill my unemployment. That actually pays me more than working there full time would have. On top of a 45 minutes commute. Fact, liars and cheats. I moved to Chicago a couple of years back. Within the first couple of months I was there, I got hammered with 3 expensive tickets, totaling $800, I think, all within one afternoon, for parking in a school zone. It was the summer, I was new to the neighborhood and the sign was pretty tough to read, but it seemed like I was in the wrong, and probably wouldn't be successful if I tried to fight it. So I start looking into my payment options and learn about a payment plan program that the city was unveiling to help folks under financial hardship pay off their tickets. Though I wasn't totally destitute by any means, I had just moved to the city to start a PhD program, and I didn't really have that kind of money just lying around. So I figure that I'll check this program out. As I'm reading up on the program, I read the fine print and learned that in order to enroll in it, you need to default on your ticket or tickets, which causes your fee to double. Then, you have to pay that new total in monthly installments. Had to scrounge up the cash to pay the tickets off, which wasn't easy, but I was very happy that I did my HW point for a program that was sold as this progressive policy to help struggling folks out. To have such a messed up clause in their fine print is downright predatory. I love Chicago, but Rahm Emanuel can seriously go fuck himself. Was trying to buy a used car. I researched how to do it, since I had never purchased a car before. Prevailing advice was to walk in with your own financing. Find a car that I liked. After several weeks of shopping, I had already notified them of my pre-approved financing, and they began running the finance paperwork. I realized as they start pushing things for me to sign that the APR was like 7 points higher than what I walked in with, and started asking questions. They tried to say it was because they couldn't get a hold of my financial institution of choice, but it was okay because I was approved by so many of this. I was suspicious, and I took the other advice I had read about car shopping. Don't be afraid to walk. I had run out of time before needing to be at work anyway, so it was good timing in that respect. During some downtime at work I got calls from the dealers saying they got a hold of my lender. Weird, since I was trying to call the lender I had chosen and got nothing. It then dawned on me, after listening to the message system, that I wasn't getting a hold of anyone because it was a bank holiday. That being the case, how is it that this car dealer had gone through back channels to presumably get a hold of them or anyone else? Fishy. The following morning I called the lender. They said they had been closed, so there was no back channel access. Since they had approved the dealer as someone they would do business with, they told me the dealer had to honor what they, the lender, offered to me, and if they didn't there would be follow up with CAB. I was given a phone number to call in case the dealer continued to try its funny business with me. I told my story to a guy that used to work at a dealership, and he asked if anyone was celebrating and high-fiving me as I was leaving with my car. Now, they were pretty bland. He then told me that means I got a good deal. No one was celebrating because I read the contract and made sure they honored the pre-approved deal with my lender, thus meaning they weren't getting 7 points extra on the back end. The last 2 times I bought a car at a dealership. I really hate car dealerships. Their sales tactics are fucking terrible and prey on people who don't fully understand what's going on by confusing the hell out of them. In both instances, I thought the payment estimate was too high based on the math in my head, but trying to get the sales guys to explain what the hell they were doing is a losing battle, since I think their end game is to just try and confuse you. Anyways, I knew what the sales price was in both instances, so I just waited until talking to the finance people to sort both out. For the first one, we traded in a pretty crappy car. They gave us $2,600 for the trade-in on it, which is in the ballpark of what I wanted. I thought the payment quote the sales guy gave us seemed a little high, so I looked through the contract pretty closely once the finance guy had it ready. Sure enough, I was right. These goofballs had put my trade-in down in a way that it looked like I owed $2,600 on the vehicle, which was getting tacked onto the loan instead of them deducting that value from what needed to be financed. I'm still fairly sure they did this on purpose, but they so embarrassed by the mistake I got a couple of free oil changes out of it. For the second one, we were buying a previous year model they still had in stock. They had the price online, and I was fine with that price. I told them, when we went in, this is what I want. I'm fine with the price, and that I wanted to do the 0% financing option instead of the cash back. The sales guys just kept asking what I wanted my payment to be, which pissed me off, because they really are only trying to figure out whatever extended warranty bullshit they can fit into that number. I told them I wanted the car with the 0% and no extended warranties. Once again, they show me some really confusing set of numbers with what my payment would be. I thought it was $50 more than it should be, but once again decided to just sort it out with the finance guy. The finance guy tried blowing through everything real quick, but I caught that they had in fact added on an extended warranty, which was making up the additional $50 in their payment estimate. Told them to take it off, and if he tried selling me one more thing I was just gonna get up and walk out. He finished up real quick and skipped over all the other bullshit he was trying to sell. Car dealerships are the worst. My ex-wife and I went to buy her a new car. Went through the process, picked it out, negotiated the price and trade-in, did the paperwork, and away we went in her new car. This was a Sunday. The next day the dealership calls us and tells us they forgot to get us to sign a few things and asked us to come in. So we head up to the dealership that evening and the salesman slides over a few things. The X already highlighted. He tells me to sign in one spot, her to sign in another. As I was her co-signer, she didn't have the greatest credit at the time. Before I signed it, I noticed they switched our names around, me as the buyer and her as a co-signer. I turned it back around and pointed out the error. He brushed that off and just said, "It's fine. We just need your signatures and you are off." I told the guy I wasn't signing it and wanted to talk to the sales manager. Sales manager comes over and explains it to me. Basically on Sunday they can't get confirmation from the bank, so they basically go off our credit scores and assume the bank will be okay. Well, her credit wasn't strong enough even with me as a co-signer, but my credit was great and they would approve me. I flipped my sheet. They ran my credit again to see if the bank would approve me and tried to pull it over our heads. I told him I wasn't buying the car, I wasn't signing it. I would be in the market for a car in a few months and I didn't want a new car already on my credit when I went to buy mine. He told me they didn't have any choice and the bank wouldn't finance her, so I told them to bring her trade-in back around and we'll undo the deal. They went away for a while and came back telling me they would figure it out with the bank the next day. I told them they better not pull any sheet. I would be checking with the bank to make sure my name isn't listed. They assured me that wouldn't happen. In the end they must have done something, because my name didn't appear on the title or the loan other than co-singer. She was listed, and we never heard from them again. Forgot the company name, but was at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. A company was offering a deal that, if you sign up with them for a free trial then you can skip the line completely. It was a long as line, so I jumped at the chance point. So the deal they said was that I could give my information and skip ahead. It was a month-long free trial. I could cancel early if I wanted to, but I could only cancel after a month and not before. Otherwise I would be charged a fee of $30 for early termination of a free trial. So I put in a bunch of info. Then they asked for my fingerprints. I gave in reluctantly. Then they asked for retinal scans and I laughed. I asked to see the terms of service and the lady immediately started pressuring me into just completing it, saying things like, "You don't trust me? And is it because I'm Latina?" At that point I decided to read the terms word for word. The terms did have an early termination fee of $299.99. If you did not cancel on time you would be charged $1,200 a year. The free trial did have a cancellation date from 27 to 30 days after for free. At that point I noped the fact back into the line. As they came up to people around me, I mentioned the fees in the terms and conditions and they definitely lost a few customers that day. Funny thing was, in the 10 minutes it took me to go through all of this, the guy I was behind before was already at that SAS scanners. The line was long, but moving incredibly fast. More of a thank god I didn't fully sign that contract moment. My wife and I were looking for a truck. She had just given birth to our first son, C-section. We live in a place where a cold as winter is a thing and trucks are kind of needed. We found one. It was an awesome truck. We both fell in love with it the moment we drove it off the lot to test it. We came back and said we'd like to talk to them about it. It was $8,000 for the truck. We had $3,500 as trade. We told him we'd go talk to the bank tomorrow about a loan. He said no worries, he knows the gal. He'll take care of it. Just sign this paperwork here. So, being young and stupid we did. We drove it off the lot. This was Friday. I went to work that weekend and my wife had to drive me. Saturday night she let me know that she didn't think she could drive it. She tore her stitches getting into it. The truck was slightly lifted, and trying to get the baby in was extremely hard for her, especially in her condition. So I said okay, we'd take it back. Monday morning we go to take it back, and the guy said, and I'm quoting, "Sorry, we don't take cars back. Besides, your car is already on its way to X city, 300 miles away. It had a bad transmission. You sold me a bad car." First off, no I didn't. That car was 4 years old and had just been through a massive checkup. Second, it had been 3 total days. We still hadn't gotten the loan from the bank for the remainder of the amount owed. Hadn't even talked to them yet. He said sorry, can't help you. So I called a friend whose dad is a lawyer. He had me bring the paperwork and sat down with me that day. See here, you didn't sign. You didn't actually sign the rights of your vehicle over, and honestly you don't own the truck, because you didn't actually sign the paperwork I didn't sign. In our haste to get out of there with our brand new truck, I didn't sign. They didn't catch it. He advised me to take the truck back, show them the contract, and leave the keys. So I did just that. My mom drove me. His reply: "You owe me $2,200 for the transmission work that was just done to your vehicle in X city." Bullshit. We left the keys and walked out. I had my mom drive me around the city, and you wouldn't fucking believe it. We found my car. It was at this shitty garage where they were working on a bunch of cars. There was my car, under shade. I walked up to the guy and said, "That's my car." He was Russian. His son came out to interpret. I explained who I was, that I owned that car. I had an extra set of keys on me, and showed him that was my name on the title. He wouldn't let me have it. So I told him I was going to call the cops. He called the guy at the dealership and in English. Remember, he didn't speak English. He said that I was about to call the cops. The dealer said just let him have it back. More of a thank god I didn't fully sign that contract moment. My wife and I were looking for a truck. She had just given birth to our first son, C-section. We live in a place where a cold as winter is a thing and trucks are kind of needed. We found one. It was an awesome truck. We both fell in love with it the moment we drove it off the lot to test it. We came back and said we'd like to talk to them about it. It was $8,000 for the truck. We had $3,500 as trade. We told him we'd go talk to the bank tomorrow about a loan. He said no worries, he knows the gal. He'll take care of it. Just sign this paperwork here. So, being young and stupid we did. We drove it off the lot. This was Friday. I went to work that weekend and my wife had to drive me. Saturday night she let me know that she didn't think she could drive it. She tore her stitches getting into it. The truck was slightly lifted, and trying to get the baby in was extremely hard for her, especially in her condition. So I said okay, we'd take it back. Monday morning we go to take it back, and the guy said, and I'm quoting, "Sorry, we don't take cars back. Besides, your car is already on its way to X city, 300 miles away. It had a bad transmission. You sold me a bad car." First off, no I didn't. That car was 4 years old and had just been through a massive checkup. Second, it had been 3 total days. We still hadn't gotten the loan from the bank for the remainder of the amount owed. Hadn't even talked to them yet. He said sorry, can't help you. So I called a friend whose dad is a lawyer. He had me bring the paperwork and sat down with me that day. See here, you didn't sign. You didn't actually sign the rights of your vehicle over, and honestly you don't own the truck, because you didn't actually sign the paperwork I didn't sign. In our haste to get out of there with our brand new truck, I didn't sign. They didn't catch it. He advised me to take the truck back, show them the contract, and leave the keys. So I did just that. My mom drove me. His reply: you owe me $2,200 for the transmission work that was just done to your vehicle in X city. Bullshit. We left the keys and walked out. I had my mom drive me around the city, and you wouldn't faking believe it. We found my car. It was at this shitty garage where they were working on a bunch of cars. There was my car, under shade. I walked up to the guy and said, that's my car. He was Russian. His son came out to interpret. I explained who I was, that I owned that car. I had an extra set of keys on me, and showed him that was my name on the title. He wouldn't let me have it. So I told him I was going to call the cops. He called the guy at the dealership in English. Remember, he didn't speak English. He said that I was about to call the cops. The dealer said just let him have it back. I have a good fact. I didn't look at the contract story, which I feel has a close enough premise. I made a business with the CEO of a company I worked at. It's hard to tell the story without explaining the business, but it had to do with US government procurement, basically helping companies sell to the government. I was young and didn't read the contract. For the anonymity of the story, I can't really say my role of the old company, but it's very important and technical. As the president of the new company, I was really excited. I trusted my old CEO who was acting as a consultant, so I was really excited. I only did the development side of things, so my old CEO handled the things like payroll, taxes, invoicing, pretty much any payment with the account, etc. Long story short, I went $400,000 in debt due to unpaid taxes on the business account my old CEO had opened for us. This happened before we had generated $400,000 in revenue. He had embezzled money from his company, the one I used to work at, using our new business account, and didn't pay taxes on it. Lesson of the story: do not under any circumstances allow someone to manage your funds for you. Take a careful look at every bank statement with your name on it, regardless of how close you are with the person managing it. Even if you feel uneducated in finance and you're working with someone who knows their shit, that's even more reason to stay in the loop on every major transaction. There is absolutely zero reason you shouldn't have access to your own account, and you're faking up if you aren't checking it regularly. Regardless of the result of the decision, do not allow any major decision to be made without your consent, and don't let it slide if it happens, even if it works out in your favor. New job opportunity. Had a rough interview session, but eventually they wanted me. So I went to the hours and they presented me the contract, which I started to read. The hour lady was confused because I was the only one who reads the whole contract. I said yeah, but I've experience in contract law, which I haven't, and I always check any contract I'm going to sign, which I also don't. I said this stuff to sound more professional. Then I read a term that says that wages include overtime. I asked the lady if this means that if I work 60 or 80 hours a week I won't get more money. She said yes. Then I said that this is an immoral contract in the sense of German laws and that I'm unable to sign the contract. The HR lady got super nervous. I continued reading and found a non-competition/exclusive clause, which means that I was not allowed to start working at a competitor for 2 years after the end of contract. I told the lady I also won't sign the contract because the contract was limited for 2 years and I would get trouble by the German Employment Bureau because I signed something that doesn't allow me to apply everywhere. Our lady called her boss. Boss came over and asked if there is any problem. I told him why I won't sign the contract. He just nodded and finally said okay, gave the hour lady the order to delete all passages I dislike and went back to his office. 2 days later I started the job and as far as I know I was the only one who got paid for overtime. Rented a huge mansion in Large Olla for a bunch of family. They all chipped in, but my name was on the Airbnb. One family brought their dog and it said pets were allowed, but I emailed the owner and confirmed that we could bring one dog. He wrote back and said that was fine with an additional $250. He also gave us a discount for prepaying 3 months in advance and said that $250 could also be discounted. So we go, have an awesome time, and we are checking out, and he sees the dog. I got 6 texts from him on the flight home saying I lied to him, and he didn't know there was going to be a dog, and I owed him $500 more for the deep clean of the home. I just texted him a screenshot of our emails, and never heard from him again. I also rented another Airbnb in Nashville for work, with 6 of us, 5 of whom didn't drink. So it was a very quiet event. I get an email with a bill for over $2,000 afterwards, saying there was drywall damage and damaged furniture from a big party. A friend told me that when corporate events are held at Airbnb, they will sometimes save up damage and try and bill it, since people are more likely to pay with someone else's money. I sent them a request for photo evidence and also said I would come back over in person to discuss. Never heard from again. TLDR. Make someone else book the Airbnb. Take pics when you arrive and leave. Was contacted by Mineral McMajor for a contract position in the Middle East back in the 90s. Sure, most of the shooting had stopped, so if they want to pony up my per diem, have hammer, will travel. Sent them my typical boilerplate contract and wait 3 weeks for this urgent fill position. Well, the contract comes back like it's been through the legal shredder of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. They tried to nickel and dime me in every possible way, wanted $1mm bonding instead of the usual $500,000, no door to door, but only paid in country, that dog don't hunt, sorry, premium economy instead of business, niet, etc. But I still needed work, so I acquiesced on a few points and held tough on others. Sent the contract back, they shred and return, lather, rinse, repeat. Finally, after a lot of bad noise, we find something I can live with and they can, in their words, deal with. Did I mention that the job was in the Middle East just north of a very recent hot zone, and I'm not referring to the local climatic conditions, and that I always have a take or pay clause in my contract, except it's a 150% top. My contract. My clause. You don't like it? Get someone else. Fair as fair can be. But the legal eagles at DC&H were not oil and gas attorneys, but rather a more general practitioner sort of ad hoc retained bunch, as Mineral McMajor had enough internal legal problems on their own to keep their legal department busy for millennia. So, signed off and dusted, I board bay in London for a nice, relaxed 7-hour flight south to the land of the Tigris and Euphrates. Did I mention it was a 6-month contract? It was, so their point nestled cozily in business class. Told you I hung tough on some points, working on my 3rd vodka and bitter lemon. The captain informs the plane that we are returning to Heathrow because our current destination was under fire and our landing airport was on fire. Oh, well, not a worry. I have a contract. Returned to London, got a hideously expensive hotel room near the airport, and called my employer to tell them of the news. They told me to ride it out for a week and see if they or I could find another way in. We are talking flights, buses, trucks, anything headed south. Well, nothing short of a B2 was headed in that direction anytime soon, and I was told, after 2 weeks of the BBC and room service, to give it up and try again in 6 or so months. So, back to Houston. Attach a herd of receipts and a very well filled out expense form to MMCM. They, of course, try to get all legally and deny virtually everything I had expensed. Then I sent them the portion of my contract that notes clock time begins when I leave my front door and ends when I return. They grunt, groan and finally acquiesce. They figured that was the end of this contract and best to just pay up and be done. Then I reminded them of the top clause of my contract. They bucked, they fought, they snarled, but had no option but to pay me $1,750 a day to sit on my ass for the next 5.25 months. Parting shot. Okay, we'll pay this time, but you'll never work for us again. Truer words were never spoken, as this company was soon embroiled in a huge accounting scandal that was a factor in the enactment of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and well, they rather went away. Worked at a part-time job, like 20 hours a week, when I was 16. After a year, they tried to force me to sign a piece of paper that said I agreed to work over 40 hours a week. I said I can't work those hours. They said it's okay, they won't schedule me for them, but I have to sign it anyway, being young and dumb, but still having enough sense to say can I bring it home and read it first. They were really pushy and kept saying they needed it now. It was in a kitchen in mid-rush mode. After a while of I really don't have a chance to read it. I would feel more comfortable reading something before I sign it. The manager finally did a huge eye roll and I went home the night and googled it. Yup, illegal. You can't force me to sign a piece of paper that says I will work more than 40 to 48 hours a week if I don't want to. I brought it back without a signature and politely explained I did not want a point after getting injured by their faulty deep fryer for putting down the 188,364 order of fries that day. They tried to write me up saying I was burned by the grease because I wasn't wearing proper equipment. What? Where in the world does a kitchen staff in a fast food place ever put on welder's gloves before dropping a small basket of fries? It would have happened to anyone. I refused to sign injured due to unsafe handling. What? Then an employee was having serious signs of a stroke, with recent history of a stroke, and just lost custody of his kid, and I asked to call an ambulance. They kept saying no, it's illegal to call an ambulance because he doesn't want one. I explained that a lot of choking victims will go into the washroom alone because of embarrassment and choke to death. Recognize the signs of stroke early. I'm in Canada, and if the ambulance comes and checks you out and doesn't bring you to the hospital, it's free. If they do bring you to the hospital, it's $50. But it's a stroke. Well, whatever happened to him ended up fading away, I think. He went on with his shift. Even though he said his face felt numb, his arm was numb, his vision and speech was being affected, and he was an extreme hothead. He got angry so quickly during busy hours. Next day I was fired after 2 years of never being written up ever. No lates. No missed days. Just because I didn't want to sign a legal paper was injured because their equipment is garbage. Argued that we should call an ambulance for our fellow coworker having every sign of a stroke. At the memories. Was commissioned to paint a legal mural for a client, gets an email a few weeks later from a random ad agency who did a photo shoot for their billion-dollar fashion client and forgot to get a release signed by me so they can run my IP as their cool factor backdrop. I'm in the middle of school midterms, so I need this drama to disappear. So I tell them I'll settle for X amount and they can only use it for X and Y. First contract sent was way below discussed amount plus WORDED to prevent me from suing them if they broke contract. Called them out, got a revision sent. Second contract was correct amount but worded to allow them to run the work as billboards, bus benches, the full 9 yards. Nowhere near what we discussed as usage. Called their bluff one last time and told them I'm out. No thanks, this low pay and exposure bucks is not worth my time. Billion-dollar client loved the photos with my work in them, and once the next day my phone blew up and I got to quadruple my payout while cutting their usage down to just social media. Lived happily ever after, got a crash course in negotiation, put some money away, and had a chill summer so far. A solar company came calling, and I told them I was not interested because I would not do a power purchase agreement. He told me they could do a no commitment, free evaluation of what an installation would be like and how much power we might expect to generate. That sounded interesting, so I thought maybe I'd do that. No matter what they showed, I had no plans to sign a power purchase agreement, and I made that clear to him. He was happy with that, probably thinking that this was better than a straight no. He told me I just needed to sign an authorization. He put the authorization in front of me and started to make a call. He said he was required to call in so that they could verify that I really was authorizing the evaluation. I thought that was a little strange, but fine. I learned a long time ago to read everything I sign, with the exception of any and all software ULAs, of course. I started to read the authorization, but suddenly there was a woman on the phone who needed to do the verification. She told me that the call was being recorded and then asked me if I was signing with full knowledge of the terms. It was worded in a very vague way and didn't actually say anything about what I was signing for. I had barely started reading, so I wasn't ready to sign anything. Her tone changed just a hair and she told the rep to call back after I had signed. He tried to whisper to me to agree, but I just ignored him. The call ended, and I started reading the authorization. The rep kept trying to talk to me, but I was insistent on reading it. I only got a short way in, and found that what he was trying to get me to sign was not an authorization to do an evaluation. It was a 20-year power purchase agreement. Once he realized I had read this, he tried to tell me that it was standard boilerplate, and I could cancel anytime before they actually started work. The look I gave him must have spoke volumes, because he got nervous, and he started stammering and trying to change the subject. I told him it was time for him to go, and he was gone. What I couldn't believe was that he showed up the next day and, trying his best to sound professional, asked me if I had thought about it and if I was now ready to sign the authorization for the free evaluation. What really bothers me about this is that if he'd caught my wife instead of me, she'd have signed without reading it, because she's a huge bargain hunter and totally would have been blinded by free evaluation. This is a sort of successful contract moment, and yet not so successful at the same time. Worked for a shitty call center. I have idiopathic hypersomnia, sort of related to narcolepsy, where you are very tired and can literally fall asleep at the drop of a hat like narcolepsy, and had let me employ an O up front of this, and they asked for a doctor's letter of this, and any accommodations that I needed to do the job before I was hired. This is all required under the law under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. They even wrote it all out in my hiring paperwork and notarized myself and the hour person signing the acknowledgement and followed up with an official acceptance of the accommodations. So my doctor had written that I had this condition and when I needed to take meds and that I needed to be able to stand up at my desk like every now and then. The job was going just fine and was actually Employee of the Month. My manager loved me and was so happy to give me more and more responsibility. Well, then the guy who worked the overpass shift got drunk during his shift and he got fired. Well, they forced me as the new guy to work the overpass shift. I was reluctant, and after a few days of it, I was exhausted. I went to my manager and told him I couldn't do the overpasses, and he scheduled other people as we had a new hire who was in training. He was going to make that guy do it. Well, it turns out that guy was the nephew of one of the VPs, and the VP was furious and came to me and told me I was back on the night shift or else I'd be fired. Well, I needed the money badly, so I had to go back to doing it. A few more days went by and I was ready to quit and really be screwed. I had just bought a home with my wife and we ran into some unexpected repairs needed and stuff. So I happened to be organizing some paperwork and I pulled out the letter my doctor had written. The second page of his letter I had just glanced at before, but in looking at it better, it also stated that I could not work in a regular schedule and could not work second or third shift jobs as it would interfere with my medications and my sleep schedule was important for my condition. And oh yes, the company had agreed to this. After that night's shift I stayed and waited for the VP to come in and told him I was not doing the night shift and told him the company had agreed when I was hired that I wouldn't have to. He fired me on the spot and had me escorted back to my desk and then out of the building. I was furious, but I didn't think of suing or anything. I just went and applied for unemployment. Well, I got word that the company was fighting my unemployment, saying I had refused to work. I pulled out the papers, had them scanned, and sent them with an email stating all of this, and that I was going to get a lawyer, and sent the email to the HR department. Within an hour I had them on the phone apologizing, and I told them I would sure, unless I got to grand. How I came up with this number I have no asterisk clue, and they would have to not fight my unemployment claim. They agreed and I had a check in my hands the next day along with an agreement I would not sue. I was so happy until about a month later I told a friend who worked for a lawyer about this and he was stunned. He said I likely would have had at least 10 times that much had I gone to a lawyer, so it was successful, yet could been a lot more so. I found out later that VP had left on his own about a week later. Quietly. One I can answer. Before moving in, my apartment complex had some fees they wanted my roommates and I to pay. I looked through the lease and most were normal, like a utility setup fee. But when I went into my resident portal, To see what all I need to pay, I saw that they wanted us to pay a reservation fee and an application fee, both of which were supposed to be waived when we signed on as part of the incentive to sign. I asked my roommates about the charges. We all signed on the same day at the same time, and only one of 3 roommates had the same charges. Another one didn't even have a utility charge that was supposed to be charged to each room. So I went to the main office with my sister and talked to one of the ladies working and asked about the charges. She offered to print out my lease for me. I only had the online version and somehow it made a difference to her, so I take it and she says all of the charges are in there and explained. I looked through, and lo and behold, the lease said that I didn't have to pay the charges that were supposed to be waived. So I called them, and I saved myself about $200 worth of fees that I would have had to pay had I not looked into the lease contract. TLDR, apartment complex tried to tell me I had to pay $200 extra in fees. Lease contract says otherwise. Here's my Google review of a management company I was interested in renting from. I was interested in a property managed by *****, but I had some concerns about the state of the property before I signed a contract. The representative took nearly 3 days to respond between emails and was difficult to reach by phone. I wanted to see a contract or a sample contract before I paid a $500 deposit because their application process stipulated that if I was approved but chose not to sign the contract, a significant sum, over $100 I believe, possibly the whole $500, would not be refunded. Naturally, I had some concerns. The sample contract I looked at was one of the most unforgiving I've seen as a tenant and included clauses about mandatory social media participation with the management company and a minimum of $6,000 fee for early contract termination. Typically you can sell a contract or help find new tenants for only a few $100s. I asked to meet with the management representative to clarify some points on the contract and he refused until I paid the deposit. I told him that if I choose not to sign the contract, I lose that money, so meeting with him could cost me $500. He confirmed this was true. That would have been an expensive, non-negotiable meeting, so I declined to pursue that rental situation any further. It appears that this company has many good reviews from property owners and very little feedback from tenants, likely because a standard rental contract includes something about an agreement by the tenant not to leave negative reviews or comments. I'm not bound by this abuse of my constitutional right to free speech, so here's my review for you all. TLDR. Tenant contract, $6,000 early termination fee, a mandatory social media participation clause, and a clause about agreeing not to leave negative reviews or comments about the company. I was recently in California for 10 days. I love lifting and didn't want to go that long without working out. So I wanted to see if my gym had a location near where I was. I didn't have a car and was staying with my cousin who lived downtown. There was a different gym where he was a member a few blocks away, so I figured I'd get a trial pass. That was $20. A little pricey for one day. I asked how much for a month and the guy told me $45. He told me he'd sign me up for a membership but waive all the fees and cancel the membership on the day I leave. I figured it was worth it if I go 3 to 4 times, considering how much I was already spending on food etc. I signed up and spent 3 hours there my first day. I got home and looked at the contract. It said I paid $45, but it also said there was a balance of $120 or something in fees etc. He didn't actually waive them, just push them back. Since I was in CA, I had 3 or 5 days to cancel, the language was unclear, and get a full refund. On the 3rd day, I went in, got a nice 2-hour workout in, and walked up to the guy and told him I wanted to cancel. I got 2 really good workouts in and didn't even have to get a guest pass. It totally wasn't my intent to be kind of a scumbag, but fuck that guy for trying to screw me over. Had I not read the contract, I would have been out another $120. Signed contract for remote work at a company, used their contract, and didn't feel bad about doing so. It was fair to both sides, and had all important points I wanted covered. Of note. 30-day notice, required chance to correct deficiencies if found, standard stuff for when you're going to be a full-time contractor. An aside, it's not ideal, but I'd just been laid off from a full-time gig. Everything was going well. I flew out to Chicago for a tech conference for my first week and got to know the crew. Things were going well, I thought, and I got along well with the 2 other folks there, my immediate boss and another developer. I get back, start looking at issues in the issue tracker, and am making a plan of attack. After first day's virtual stand-up, the manager asked to talk to me one-on-one. To my regret, I didn't record it. He told me he thought it wasn't working out, and that I'd not be working effective immediately. I brought up the 30-day notice and said that they were free to pay me for not working if they felt that strongly about it, which I was very confused by, as I hadn't even had a normal day to work to show anything of value or not, but that they couldn't just decide to not pay me. That if there was something in particular he felt wasn't a good fit, I'd be happy to work on it. He couldn't name anything, just that he didn't want to draw it out and to talk 2 hours if there was anything else. Naturally, that's what I did. Point, they were confused, but seemed to not want to raise the ire of whoever it was and put me in touch with the CEO. I found out quickly that he was a Texan good old boy and felt like rules were there only when convenient to him. He offered me, after I pointed out that it was their contract and as much as I'd rather work I had no issues with taking legal action to get money, he offered me 1 week's pay, not extra, etc. Then, after they were served papers about my civil case, he offered me 2 weeks pay. Point, to cut an already too long story short, I filed 1. Got judgment for entire amount owed according to contract plus interest. The sad ending is that they are based in Texas and I live in Virginia. Actually enforcing the judgment is something I'm at a loss on where to even start. Plus, shortly after that, I got an offer at a new company and have been working there ever since. I should probably get off my ass and figure out how to collect, but bleh. This happened about 10 years ago during the housing crisis. My parents were in some deep shit with the payments. Someday out of nowhere a person shows up at our door and talks to my parents about lowering our payments through their program. My parents call me to help them translate. They can understand English, but can't read it. I was only 12 at the time and hated reading legalized papers, but something struck me odd about the situation. I read through it a few times and understood it to be something like this: you will sell us your house for free and you will pay us rent. I was 12, I thought, no way we would ever do this. Point, sure, I was young reading legalize to translate it to Spanish, but I told my parents, let's take this paper to someone that can understand it, because what I'm understanding doesn't seem right. So we ask the person if we can keep the paper and sign it later. He says that they can't do that. I ask why. He says they just can't. I say we won't sign it now until we know for sure what signing this means. He says that's the only one he has. I ask if we can make a copy, and he still says no. So he takes the paper back and gives me a paper that is a copy of a copy of a copy and says we can have that, and says he will come back. This paper was something completely different with the same logo of the company. So we take that paper and take it to our bank, where our house loan is from, and ask what this was about. The banker takes one look at it and tells us that whatever it is, this was not to sign anything, as it seemed like a scam. Point, thinking back to it, what it appeared to be was some scammers trying to get people to sign up for a loan under the name of a real bank or financing company. I guess keeping the paper would allow someone to trace the scam back to them. The next time someone showed up was a lady asking the same exact thing and showed us the same papers. We told her no and to stop coming back. They kept sending agents over, but we never answered the door and eventually they stopped coming. Point, TLDR, someone didn't let us keep a copy of the contract and we stopped answering the door to strangers for a couple of years. Went to sign up at a martial arts school that had Taekwondo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under the same roof. Point, I was handed a contract and told it's just like all the other 12-month contracts out there. Point, for those that don't know, usually you sign an agreement to pay in advance so that the owner of the school can budget month to month. There is also usually a discount for paying in advance. If you pay month to month and break the contract, then you can be sure that you won't be getting hit by anything in court, as not having to teach you is not an injury in most cases. You don't pay, they don't teach, nobody is out anything, especially when you're talking about less than $1,000 in tuition. This contract said that I was financing a year of lessons through another company. I noped out immediately. I assumed, and later found out I was right, that the owner of the school owned the financing company as well. Since the finance company paid the martial arts school for the year in advance, the finance company was out of the money and did have an injury to claim in court if you broke the contract. I told the owner of the school that I wasn't interested, and he got belligerent with me and asked what I would do if I was attacked by somebody that knew martial arts. I told him, I'll shoot them, and then I walked out. I've had to break martial arts school contracts before because of moving or injury. This guy was just shady as fuck all the way around. I work for a reasonably well-known cell phone company that specializes in low-cost service with no contract. That's all fine and dandy, but people often don't want the low to mid-tier phones we offer cheaply and gravitate towards the more expensive phones for quality. Naturally, the prices on Apple products and upper tier droids are up there, and that's where the bullshit comes into play. We partner with Progressive Leasing, a separate company, and you only pay $49.99 that day to start the lease. Cool, right? No, absolutely not. After applying in store, they authorize you for a certain amount of money and blah blah. You get your phone plus accessories if you want. And after the sale, the customer reads the leasing terms. Say someone gets an iPhone 8 Plus, which we are currently selling for $799.99. You have a few options for leasing, ranging from a 3-month buyout option to spreading it out over a year or two. Most opt for the year because it sounds reasonable, but in reality the company ends up charging you over $2,000 thanks to their insane interest rates. Even if you knock it out in 3 months with the buyout, you still pay them an extra $250 or so. It's subtly insane and takes advantage of people in a terrible way. TLDR, companies charge crazy interest rates, but only show the nonsense after the sale is processed, basically doubling the cost of funds. This was in China. I signed up to work as an English teacher. There was an agency that handled the contracts, so they sent me a contract. I read it. It was okay, so I signed it. In the contract, one clause said I could have any 3 days off with pay during each semester for whatever reason. So when late spring rolled around, I checked out the summer schedule, which had all kinds of holidays and irregular scheduling dispersed, and I realized that the way my schedule and the school's schedule lined up, so that during 2 weeks, I had only 3 days of work, and they just happened to be my busiest days. So I told the administrator I would be taking those 3 days off, as per the contract, which would give me 2 whole weeks off. She said okay. I reminded her every week for 2 months about this. She said okay every time. So I planned a vacation, 2 weeks of sightseeing. I even went to Mongolia by the Trans-Siberian Railway. I come back 2 weeks later to the last week of work, and the administrator is fuming. Where have you been the last 2 weeks? She asks. I tell her I have been off, as I had told her 8 times already, and which she agreed to. You can't do that, she claims. So I calmly show her the clause in the contract that clearly state I can, and she is flabbergasted. The contract the school had with the agency didn't have that clause at all. So the contract I signed and the one the school signed didn't match. The agency had added and removed clauses in both the Chinese and English version in order to get both parties to sign, so the contracts didn't match at all. Also, while we compared contracts, the administrator grudgingly mentioned how much money she paid for me, and for that price I better show up and yada yada. Excuse me, how much did you say? Turns out the agency charged the school 5 times more for my salary than what they actually paid me. They just pocketed 80%. So the school paid through the nose, and I got a shitty salary and no one of us knew. No wonder the admin was so bitchy. But the admin let me be, and went after the agency instead. They never renewed contracts with them after that. So I didn't get into trouble at least, but it would have been nice with a 500% raise, had I been able to read Chinese. This wasn't really a contract thing, but I suppose it falls under this category somehow. I bought a used Ford Escape a few years ago. Vehicle report, not Carfax, showed everything was good, no accidents. About 6 months into owning it, my wife is sideswiped in it in a hit and run. I have full coverage insurance. Take it to the Ford dealer for repairs. The dealership calls me to tell me that there is extensive bumper damage. My wife was sideswiped on the passenger front tire and that was it, so I didn't understand how the bumper was faked. I went in, and they showed me the damage. I went home and did a Carfax report, and it showed the vehicle was in a front-end collision a few years ago. I took that report and the one they gave me when I purchased the vehicle to the used dealer, as the Ford dealer basically told me you can't have this vehicle back until this is fixed. It's a huge safety issue. By the way, fixing the bumper was going to cost about $2,000. So I walk into the used car dealership and politely ask to speak to the manager/owner. Filled him in on what was going on. He said initially he would be happy to pay for a portion. I told him no, you can pay for the whole faking thing because you sold me a car that was in a front-end collision and you gave me paperwork saying it's never been in an accident. If you don't pay for the whole thing, I'll have the Ford dealership tow the now undrivable Escape and park it in front of your goddamn doors to your sales office. He said let me see what I can do. I'll call you later today. A few hours later I get a call from the Ford dealer telling me my bumper has been completely paid for by the used car dealership. Needless to say, do as much research on any used vehicle, even if it's going to cost you money to pull reports. It could potentially save you thousands in the long run. P.S. This used dealership owner advertises on the gas pump TVs at my local speedway. Every time his commercial comes on I'm instantly furious about the ordeal again. Interviewed with a hospital for a highly specialized nursing position. They were chasing me. I asked for $X hourly wage. Bowers offered me less, but I was asking for exactly the same hourly amount I was being paid at that time. The catch was, the huge, highly regarded hospital I was employed at was known for two things: low hourly wages and no extra specialty pay for niche jobs. They go by the saying, we respect all our nurses, so we pay everyone the same, regardless of the job. Example, in the area I work, I'm required to hold numerous specialty certifications that aren't required of regular nurses. So in my area, nurses are typically paid an hourly wage, plus a small stipend for having certifications, which require me to study for, and pay hundreds of dollars, to sit for an exam, and then pay hundreds yearly to keep my certs, and another small stipend for working in an area that requires me to be on call 24/7. My employer at that time paid a flat hourly rate instead, one of only a few hospitals in the country to do so, because of the honor of working for them. So, just as an example, not actual numbers, I was being paid $35/HR at my current job, with no extra stipend for carrying specialized certifications, though my job required those certs, or extra call pay, unlike nearly every other hospital in the country. I was asking for my new employer to pay me the same $35/HR, knowing that they also pay $4/HR for credentials and $4/HR call pay whenever I'm on call. So actually, my hourly wage would jump to $39/HR, plus $4/HR call whenever I had to carry the pager. But my hourly wage would remain the same. Yay me, finally getting the extra bit of pay that every other hospital gives to nurses who can do my job. Bowers balked. They wouldn't believe I made that much at ex-employer, because that employer pays at least $10/HR under the going rate. So I produced a check stub, knowing that my new employer typically paid well, and I was asking for the going rate in my area. I wasn't trying to rip them off, but I wasn't trying to take a pay cut. After they saw that I made $35/HR, they agreed to match my hourly rate. This is important, because if I decided to move around within their hospital and take a different position, like in the ICU, I need to make that hourly rate, with or without any extra pay. But since they agreed to pay me $35/HR, I was happy. The morning that I arrived to sign my contract, I read it through. Bowers had changed my hourly rate. I was still making $35/HR, but only after figuring in specialty pay and call pay. They took those extras, let's say $8/HR, and deducted it from my hourly, so it was reflected as $27/HR. When I pointed it out, the hour beach tried to convince me that it all added up in the end. I asked, but what if I want to move out of my specialty area? How would that hourly rate be perceived? She said, oh, of course we would look at the overall rate that you're paid. Nope. That's not how it works. Hourly pay is hourly pay, extras don't add in. When you change jobs, regardless of the fact that I have paid for, studied for, and worked for all these years in a very highly specialized area that very few can do, I refused to sign until they changed it. I'm so grateful that I did, because after a few years of employment, my hospital lost a huge insurance contract, and my specialty area went through major changes. I made a lateral move, and without my hourly rate, I would have been docked, pay to make nearly $10/HR less than I had made many years ago. I still feel totally butthurt that they tried to play me like that, especially when I got wind of how much $$ my employer was paying to other recruits in my area. I'm staying for the pension plan, but damn it, I'm glad I looked over that contract, or else I'd still be hustling to make up the pay gap I'd lost when I changed employers as wholes. This was back in 2002ish, when it wasn't entirely uncommon for people to not even have their own email address, and it was basically unheard of for people to have work computers they took home, or even the ability to work remotely at all point. So the company I worked for came out with a new computer use policy that was rather poorly written and became overly broad. What they meant to say: we can read your 1. business or 2. personal emails that use 1. our computers, 2. our physical network, 3. our digital network. It was to cover themselves if you, say, got issued a laptop to go on a business trip, which my position would never be, and you signed into your personal email from that laptop when you were off site, and it sniffed the text, then they wouldn't get in trouble. What they actually said was, we can read your emails, personal or business, on our network or not, on our machines or not. Obviously they weren't going to hack into my personal email that never saw a whiff of their machines or network to read my emails, but the policy they wanted me to agree to gave them the right to do it. I refused to sign without striking out and rewriting the offending bits to say what they actually meant. They refused to accept that correction. Eventually they decided that the original computer use policy I signed as a new hire was sufficient, and I didn't have to sign the new policy. Apparently that was an easier sell to corporate than me fixing their oops. Another car dealership one. Probably the most common response. I wonder why. Got to the contract signing part, and the discount was only $2,000 off MSRP. Which is great, but I'd been offered $1,000 off originally, and then another $2,000 off on top of that. I look at it and say, excuse me, but this is incorrect. I was offered an additional $2,000 off the original $1,000 discount. This should read $3,000 off. The finance guy says no, you were offered $2,000 off. Total. I whip out my phone and show him the email. See, here it says an additional $2,000 off on top of the original $1,000 discount we offered you. He looked at me and said, we don't do that. It's $2,000 off. The salesperson made a mistake. I was like, oh, so did I, sorry. And then I just got up and left. They called me back and said they were losing money on the deal, but didn't want to get a reputation for not keeping their word, and I could have the car for $3,000 off. I said no thanks. 15 minutes later, they called back again and said, good news, we figured a way to get you $3,500 off. I was like, so you were losing money on the supposedly mistaken offer, but now you're willing to lose another $500 just so I don't think you're dishonest? Sure, buddy. Sure, but it was a good price, so I went down there. Contract looked legit. The discount was $3,500 as promised. But something nagged at me. I'm not 100% sure why, but I took out the ML printout again. Sure enough, the VIN numbers were different. I called it to their attention, and the finance guy said, oh, well, we couldn't offer you a discount that steep on the car you originally wanted, so we found a comparable one. I asked if I could go see this comparable one, and they reluctantly escort me out to the lot. It's the same model, same color, but a much lower trim level and none of the aftermarket goodies they'd installed in the other one. Fully unloaded is how I would describe it. Apples to apples, it was about $1,800 less than the car I thought was buying. So the $3,500 discount I thought I was getting was turned into $1,700 off, a full $300 less than they'd tried to scam me with originally. The best part, they were mad at me because they'd gone to a lot of trouble to help save me money. I noped out of there, ASAP. Bought a lemon from a shady car dealership. They also sold me an extended warranty. I don't know much of anything about warranties, but it seemed too good to be true. After reading the fine print, covered damn near anything for a ridiculously low fee, so I asked him to sign and date the form. He said there wasn't a spot for him to do so and it already had a notarized signature from the third-party company they contracted with, so his signature would be meaningless. Told him I would skip on the car without it. So he signed. After a few days it starts acting up. I find out there's a major problem that they purposefully covered up. I give my mechanic the warranty info. He contacted the company, calls me later to say they've never heard of this dealership and they don't provide such broad warranties on used cars. Mechanic says I think they just committed fraud. Get a lawyer, I'll hold the car. Lawyer says there's nothing he can do unless the warranty is signed by the dealer. Cause they can just argue that I was confused or they didn't know what I was on about. Apparently the salesman didn't realize this. Turns out the $3,000 worth of damage was due to a joyride. He'd taken the car on the day before I went in to buy it. He had a buddy come in to do a cheap patch-up job, then spammed the website with ads to offload it as soon as possible before the patch failed. Took me 2 weeks, but I got a full refund. An internship that made you pay for your training. The way it worked was that whilst you trained, your courses, any qualifications and pretty much anything else were added to a debt you owed them. Now there was a clause that they made much of that said it only becomes your debt if they make you a job offer at the end of the 6-month period, at which point you would work off accrued training costs at a percent up to a maximum of $200 per paycheck. If you quit early or didn't take the job, you were on the hook for all of it plus an admin fee of a couple $100 I think. There was no breakdown of costs involved, just a backquote guideline that estimated around $3,000, but individuals may require more or less training. The manager going through the paperwork with me couldn't give a better estimate of costs. It was basically signing something that gave them free license to add as much debt to you as they liked and give you no option but to work for them at whatever contract they offered for, as long as it would take to bring that presumably large debt down to an amount you could pay off. They were very good at making this all seem reasonable and normal. I reported them, but they still seem to exist. Supposedly it's legal because they make it about education and training, not pay to work. It was advertised not too dishonestly. The point was that you would do a mixture of interning in the company and be provided training and industry qualifications, then work to pay if you completed. It wasn't ideal, but the training they were offering seemed worth it to me. Had it been fixed price, etc. This had too many loopholes for abuse, and their evasiveness at explaining what kind of contracts/terms, level of debt, etc. It was like they had seen someone else doing a legitimate delayed payment training scheme and found a way to game the system into almost fraud. I live in a small town and wanted to move to a nearby large city to work in it, so I went job hunting online. One of the places I found sounded like it would be right up my alley. Front-end based, rarely talked to clients, didn't have to upsell anything. Just drive to the location, fix their stuff, and leave. However, daddy didn't raise no fool, so I looked up this company I have never heard of to see what their history was before I sent an application in. Didn't take me very long to find a site where employees could review their employers, and this company had a 1/5. From various reviews, I found the following: they either lied about or didn't state in their application info. Work was contract based, not salary or hourly, so you'd only get paid after the job is done. Employee had to pay all expenses, including vehicle, gas, and even replacement parts. The company would reimburse the employee with their pay. Upselling everywhere. Many ex-employees stated that they were told to not even touch a computer without trying to get the customer to pay some extra fee for something. Some of the contracts weren't even contracts. The employee would go to a random business and offer to fix their stuff for FRE asterisk. Asterisk WITH applicable fees when stuff was found. Similar to phone scammers, pretty much everyone who reviewed the company said that they were never paid nor reimbursed for expenses. Lots of upcoming court cases noped right the hell out of that, but stayed long enough to report the application to the job site. When I purchased a mobile home last year, I spent nearly 3 weeks going back and forth to the dealership to haggle. When we finally came to an agreement, we sat down to do all the paperwork, and the contract was missing the turnkey parts of the purchase, setting up both halves of the double wide, underpinning, electrical/water/septic hookups, etc. Also, they neglected to include my $10,000 deposit and acted like it was the computer's fault for not including it. I almost walked out right then, but it was worth my time to waste the dealer's time so he couldn't screw someone else out of money. It took over 45 more days before they finally got everything set up so I could move in. They forgot to mention I'd have to pay county fines for moving the trailer without a permit, as well as several other fees and fines, since they didn't get the local paperwork done before moving the trailer. When the first payment came due and I couldn't move in because power still wasn't hooked up, I told the finance company that did the loan I was not paying them a dime until I could move in. The dealer had not upheld their end of the deal, so I was under no obligation to pay just because the trailer was physically located on my property. The finance company got things to moving and I was able to move in the next week. The finance manager at the dealership was also fired. TLDR. Bought a mobile home. Finance manager tried to screw me out of my $10,000 deposit in previous agreements. Grandfather was a barber from the he could walk to the day he died, and the time came to sell some of the equipment he had acquired over his lifelong career that was unreasonable for us to keep. For example, heavy reclining barber chairs and the like. The decision was made to auction the inventory, and it was an interesting experience. The auctioneer talked a sweet game, and we had all but signed the papers for the deed to be done when we asked for an itemized list of what we were paying for. An upfront price here, a percentage of sales there. Nothing seemed particularly outlandish except for a vague plus expenses. In all honesty, I thought nothing of it in the moment, but made the passing comment to a cousin that sounds like an open wallet plus expenses. Open wallet being an inside term for the entire situation we were trying to avoid by obtaining said itemized list. Cousin: yeah, this seems rather thorough. What do you mean by plus expenses? Auctioneer: just that we'd have to pay someone to hold items up for the auction. Me: okay, so can't we just include their wage to this number? I'm fine with paying them for their time, I'd just like that to be noted in the agreement. He immediately gets uncharacteristically defensive about how this has been drawn up twice already and just oddball frustration at a simple request. I told him I'd be fine with a solid number, but don't care to pay for him to travel to Italy to research and appraise the barber chairs. And he got livid. I don't know if I struck a chord with the guy, but he went berserk and we kicked him out. All because he didn't want to add a man's wage. After I graduated, the Swedish equivalent to high school, I was invited to an interview at the ad department of a smallish call center. I looked them up, but find quite literally nothing on them. Oh, well, no worry. The interview is successful. I'm offered a position as a support technician. Now, this company was based out of a city some 300 kilometers from where I lived, so obviously it was a huge step for 20-year-old me, but it also meant I had to either wait for them to send my employment contract and subsequently sign and send back, or move and sign when I start. I chose the latter during the interview. Everything felt so perfect, as had the job ad, work with the stuff I used during my free time, version control, servers, some development, and even telephony switches from Avaya. When first day of work rolled around, everything felt weird. None of the people I met during the interview was present. They told me, don't worry, they're based out of another building. Okay. There were lots of other people there as well. They tell me, we're here for call center agent training. Okay, point by day 3, the training is finished, and they put us next to these really shitty, obviously second-hand, computers, and hand us the slimiest piece of script I've ever read in my life. Hello. I'm calling from this company we're really not but whose products are cheap. I can read in my papers that your gold membership is in need of renewal. For just. At this point, I'm beyond suspicious. I don't place a single call this day, but I'm camped in the manager's office, pestering her for an employment contract. I've moved across the country, uprooted my life, for a position they lied about. Either way, I get my employment contract, which says nothing about anything, really. With nothing but a spoken contract and empty promises, there's no real hope of suing them or anything. Luckily, I was offered a real position at a real department just a few days later in the same city, so it all worked out alright. Later, in the hopes of reporting them to the National Trade Organization for call center businesses, I looked them up. But by this time, they've already disbanded the firm. My then fiance and now wife and I settled on a catering hall for our wedding reception. After the salesman and I agreed on terms, he said congratulations, sent out the invites, and provided me with the contract. I took it home and read it, and found it contained an indemnity clause that we indemnify them from any legal action arising from the event. Point now, picture that one of your guests has a little too much to drink, goes out and gets into a car accident. The victim can't name the hall that served the alcohol in their lawsuit. The hall doesn't really care. They could turn to you and force you to pay for their legal defense and any settlement costs. Even simpler, one of your guests falls down the stair, slips in the bathroom, chokes on an hors d'oeuvre, etc. etc. You would be on the hook. I asked the salesman to strike it, and he said don't worry, nothing like that ever happens. I said great, then you won't mind striking it. They have a liquor license and are required to carry commercial insurance. We went back and forth between my attorney, their owner, and their attorney, and they never did agree. That caused me huge anxiety leading up to our wedding. We dropped them and had to scramble to find another place. That place had the same damn clause in their contract, but they were willing to strike it right away. We ran into the same issue with several places later on, for kids' birthdays, etc. To the extent I won't even go to look at the place unless they agree to strike that clause ahead of time. An ex-coworker of mine got roped into a pyramid scheme by her roommate at her college, whose dad was running the whole thing. She and her roommate called on a conference call and asked to meet me and discuss a potential business venture/investment. I knew from the get-go what was up, and I knew how gullible this ex-coworker was, so I went to the meeting in hopes of dissuading her from continuing on with all this. I wore a t-shirt and jeans. They wore business attire, like expensive looking sheet. I assumed it was part of the front to make them look legit. Anyway, the roommate said that my ex-coworker told her that I was smart and clever and blah 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 and they'd love to sign me on, and so on and so forth. This is where it gets weird, because I don't know if pyramid schemes have you sign any paperwork, but she presented me with a work contract and tapped on the dotted line at the bottom with a pen for an uncomfortable amount of time and asked me to sign. When I picked the paper up to read it, her voice changed completely and she forcefully said leave the paper on the table, sir. I wasn't spooked, but I did it because I really wanted to see the kind of nonsense written in here. According to this contract, I had to sign over my credit/debit card information for accountability and security purposes. I wasn't allowed to take them to court for any reason due to the nature of the business. I had to fork over $2,500 upon signing for some other bullshit reason I can't remember. They also wanted my social security number, but most to all jobs do. Though, I wouldn't trust this one with it. For some reason, I would have to be on call for the CEO and any other high-ranking members of the company day and night as well. All very weird. I don't know if pyramid schemes have these sorts of contacts shoehorned in with them normally, but when my ex-coworker described the business to me over the phone the first time she called me about it, it sounded just like a pyramid scheme, so I didn't know what to think. Anyway, the contract was laughable, and I told the lady that most of the stuff in it was illegal. She scowled at the floor for a secretary, then told my ex-coworker that they were leaving. I texted her again after that to see if she was okay, but she did not respond. TLDR, an obvious illegal scheme tried to get me to sign away my debit card info with a contract that used the smallest font size I've ever seen. When I bought my first car used, of course I took it to get serviced the next day after I bought it. The car's a BMW, so obviously it was gonna have a lot of problems. Got the car report back, and the oil gasket was leaking, along with the power steering wheel and a whole bunch of stuff. $5,000 plus worth of repair, when I had gotten the car for $4,000. I called the place I got it from and asked if the mechanic can cover some of the jobs, because it said it could cover both power steering wheel and oil gasket in the paperwork. They were hesitant, but said sure to bring it in the next day and we'd talk in person. The next day I go over there, and they initially denied that any of the car problems would be covered in the paperwork, but I brought everything with me and had everything highlighted. Then they said that it'd take about a week because there were a lot of cars to work on, yada yada. They were trying to get me to leave the car, so the 3-day grace period, or whatever, would pass, and they wouldn't have to work on it, thus leaving me with an essentially broken car, or at least one that wouldn't last me long. Luckily I kept all the paperwork and told them that they either work on the car the same day or they could have the car back, since I wasn't gonna be paying more for repairs than I paid for the whole damn car. TLDR, car dealership sold me a car with lots of problems, tried to tell me that some of the problems can't be fixed despite the fact it's in the contract, and tried to keep the car past the 3-day grace period so they didn't have to fix it. Everything that the paperwork/contract said it had agreed to fix. My last job, they decided to restructure a lot of the business at ground level. Started with management, a lot of those lost their jobs. Moved on to team leaders, many got redundancy. Then came the new contracts for the floor staff. There were a lot of posters everywhere gloating how good it was going to be and what a wonderful raise everyone was getting. Basically corporate propaganda. They also had to release proposed new contracts to the unions and the staff to read through. They were pretty well hidden, but accessible to someone that would go digging. I went digging. The new contracts stipulated minimum notice before shift of 1 hour. They broadened the role to not only being one department, but entire collection of all departments involved in the store. Changed how they refer to staff in the contract. You're no longer a colleague, you are a partner and work not for the store, but for the business group. This included other locations and other store brands. Remember the raise? Well, it turns out that all recognition and bonus schemes along with premium paid on Sundays or bank holidays is getting scrapped. Night shift premium is getting reduced and only paid between the hours of 1 AM and 5 AM. Essentially making a good chunk of currently employed staff get paid less. Paid breaks also have now been removed, which then reflects in your contracted hours as decrease, and you lose out on some of the benefits you may be relying on from the government because the job already paid terribly. People that were on 39H full-time contracts now went down to 36H contracts. They introduced changes to the absence policy which stipulate if you are absent for mere 2% of your contracted hours in a rolling year term, if you're off for a week and a half, there will be disciplinary action taken against you. There was stipulation of 1H notice before working in any of group locations. The good news was you'll have to make your own way there and will not be compensated for travel costs or insurance. Generally, if you travel from one work location to another in the UK, you need commercial insurance as your standard social domestic pleasure, and commuting will not cover you. You would also now be expected to do the work team leaders used to do without the team leader pay, and managers were now responsible for multiple departments per manager. If you thought you never seen one beforehand, you would need to book an appointment to see one now. What I essentially did was print out multiple copies of these proposed contracts and staple them around the store so people have easy access to information. That didn't fly so well, and I had a lovely sit down with management. They tried to discipline me for it, but had no leg to stand on, as this was meant to be available to all staff for review before they were forced to either sign or be terminated. I got a new job and handed in my resignation. Agreed to work on verbal agreement, told I would get contract to sign after a trial period. Near the end of my trial period I was given a contract that had a non-compete clause when I had a seasonal job at another employer in the same industry for a different season that my employer knew about when hiring me. Both jobs were seasonal. Not to mention the poor language, leaving many parts of the contract lacking clarity and basic definitions of roles. They had copy and pasted a list of what tasks I did for them that I requested I make. Many tasks were unrelated to my job title and had been me helping out in other areas of the job. I was being assigned responsibilities that could lead to me being liable for certain incidents that were not part of my job. I also had to give up rights to anything I came up with during the contract. The wording was poor and didn't state if it applied only to those on company time or if it applied to everything during the time period, even if I came up with an idea in bed before I go to sleep on a weekend. Fortunately, I was told to make any necessary changes, so I got it reviewed by a lawyer I know and sent back a new contract with changes I wanted. Lawyer basically told me not to sign it unless certain changes were made because it was a shitty one-way contract for employer and I could be burned easy. On the last day of my trial period I sat down with the boss and negotiated the contract. He agreed to most changes and there was some give and take on a few other items. I had initialed changes in parts we had agreed on. He decided to fill in my name and sign a check for the monies I had been owed to that point. I told him I would review it and have it signed for the beginning of the next week. I needed to be sure the check would clear. I did not look at the contract or check at the time as I felt it was better to privately review. I then gave him a ride to an event we had to put on that night. I should have quit that day and screwed him for transport to the event point. The next day I went to review the contract. I immediately knew not to sign it as he had filled in my name at the top, not a signature, but had spelt it wrong. The changes I had made were in a different color to be identified easier by my employer. The contract he gave me still had these. I had basically written half the thing inadvertently. If I'd known half the stuff I was writing was going into the contract I would have put in a clause for just green M&Ms or something. Next I went to look at the check and the written dollar amount and the numerical one were different. I took pics for my personal files and sent an email to the boss describing issue with the check and contract. He sorted out the check, but never sat down again to sort out the contract. Naively I continued working for him under the premise that he was just too busy running the business to sit down as he had bitten off more than he could chew. Then decided he had to expand his role in a certain part of the business that was in a different city than the office. Then I stopped getting paid. So did my coworkers who had signed contracts. I still work for the other seasonal job, and I'm glad I didn't sign that contract, although it might not have changed anything if I had. Finally one I can answer, but obviously way too late. A fuck it point. So I wanted to start at a company which was basically a glorified taxi service. I turned 17 and just had my driver's license for about a year. They also hired a lot of students. So I had worked for them a few times before, since they were in need of people at that time point. After those few times they offered me a 0-hour job. This means that I have no standard hours to work at, and they can call me when they need me. I was like, okay, why not? However, my dad told me I should bring the contract home before signing it, so he could check it for me. Turns out there were 3 pretty big things that cold turned out really bad for me. Any damage to the taxi cars would be for me to pay. Kinda reasonable, but then again, they have insurance for this, right? They had a part of the contract saying that I wasn't allowed to have any other jobs next to this one. Failing to comply would allow them to fine me up to €2,500 per day. I had to be ready at all times to come to work, no matter what the circumstances. School? Too bad. Sick? Too bad. Already other plans? Too bad. This could also be fined with €2,500 per day failing to comply. After seeing these rules it was a very big no for me. My autistic son, 5 at the time, had to be evaluated by the public school system in order to qualify for a scholarship, about $20,000 annually that can be used for his education. The school system needed to agree that my son was autistic, not developmentally delayed. Autism equals I get funding for his education versus Development delay equals the school can use the money how they see fit is basically the difference from a legal standpoint for how they can spend the funding. My son spent 3 days being evaluated by occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, behavior therapy, and several sessions with the school psychologist, who is in charge. I also want to point out my husband is a pediatric physician, and in addition our son was evaluated and diagnosed for our health insurance in the previous year. My son is clearly autistic, and we have been told so by several professionals. A friend of mine is an advocate for parents of autistic kids, and went with me to the meeting to decide the verdict, because she said they could be brutal. I had no idea. She also told me it was illegal for them to make a decision prior to the meeting, because the findings had to be discussed with all the therapists. I walked into a huge conference room with every therapist sitting at the table and the psychologist at the head. They all went over their findings. An hour of my son's physical and mental delays is emotionally difficult. Every single therapist agreed with an autism diagnosis. I was very emotional, with lots of tears, and now I have to read a 30-page contract the psychologist pulled out one set of paperwork, previous filled out before hearing what the therapist thought, to move things along faster, and passed it around. My advocate friend popped up, at which the psychologist asked for credentials that were ready and handed over. Turns out she only filled out the development delay paperwork and proceeded to bully everyone into the correct diagnosis. My friend did a stellar job and sounded like the most expensive lawyer I have ever heard. She read the contract and threw it back at her saying, if it wasn't changed to represent the correct findings there would be legal ramifications. Once everything went through and we got the funding, I pulled him from that school so fast. Our son is now homeschooled with a tutor, and several therapists work with him a week. He can read and write. Psychologist said it couldn't happen. It's only a year later I'm pretty sure. Once the psychologist couldn't reverse my son's diagnosis within the school system, there were legal ramifications. My friend was super angry, and she's stellar at her job. Went under contract on a unicorn new build property, south facing end unit townhome with a 360 rooftop view of the mountains and downtown Denver, unique angles, tons of sunlight, and a 1300 SQFT yard. My realtor, whom I trusted, advised me not to worry about getting the specifics on dimension/property lines. This went against my intuition, but she was highly recommended and trusted by a close friend who had bought several homes through her, so I brushed my concerns aside. Several months into the build, I get antsy about still receiving zero information, and get in touch with the GC. He tells me my property line ends 5 feet from the building. My realtor proceeds to tell me the land is a government utility easement, and that I can still fence it in, given I ensure that workers have access to the power box and lines. She negotiates $3K back, less than 0.5% of my price, with the opposing realtor, who I believe made an honest but negligent mistake. Perturbed but without great options, I trusted her. Drove by a month later, and the entire area was paved. Decided to take matters into my own hands, and got all plot documents, and building plans and easement grant, took them to an attorney. Turns out I have no yard. The space that isn't a public driveway, not a utility easement, is a public walkway, not a utility easement, and I can't legally fence it in. When I walked, both realtors were still trying to convince me I could still fence in some of the land, directly contradicting both the GC and the lawyer. 9mo wasted, and a huge market opportunity missed. Found out later the dream property my realtor talked me out of underbidding, at 90%, sold for 85% of asking. So a few years ago I bought my own car on my own. While I was privy to the tricks of salespeople, I wasn't all that aware of the tricks of the finance department. My bank gave me an interest rate a little over 8%. At this point, I was pissed as I had financed with them previously and had a few years of excellent payment history. I applied at another credit union, but never heard back, so figured that they forgot about me. I went to the dealership and negotiated a great price on the car. So I'm taken to financing. I mentioned that I had my own financing, and they said they may be able to beat it. They got me around 4%, but I had to buy a warranty, GAP protection, etc. I took home the agreement and read through it. I realized that even with the lower financing, with the extras, I would be paying more during this loan term than I would have been if I had kept the 8%. Like $5,000 more. I was pissed that I fell for it. One of my friends told me that the finance department is willing to take a hit on the financing part if they can make it up somewhere else. On the surface it seems like you are getting a good deal, really you aren't. Warranties and GARP protection are fine, but you can get them from your bank for a much cheaper price than what the dealership charges. That credit union called back 2 days later and told me I was approved at the same rate the dealership offered me, no extra required. I asked about warranties and stuff, and they offered then at around 35% what the dealership sold me. So to the contract part. I was trying to figure out how to get out of this. The dealership told me the deal was done. Lo and behold, I read all the contracts and saw that if I cancelled in 30 days, I can get a full refund. I called the different companies to confirm and yep, it was true. So I went back to the dealership, told them about the conversation I had and what the contracts said, and they relented and cancelled the deals. A couple years ago my Subaru Outback Legacy had the head gasket explode, and I was in very serious need of a car. My coworkers got cars at Drive Time and highly recommended I get a car there. I got there, test drove a decent used car, and they made it seem very affordable. Wouldn't tell me my interest rate at the moment, but promised it was very good. They told me my payments were $300 and they purposely tried making it seem like the payments were monthly. I'm schizophrenic and at the time was on no medication, so I was pretty out of it and wasn't really able to read the papers myself. They made the deal seem really good though. Thankfully my dad was on his way to help me check it out, and even though they kept pushing for me to sign, I waited for my dad. The deal was the biggest load of bullshit. That $300, they wanted me to pay either weekly or bi-weekly, I can't remember which, but both was so beyond out of my budget as I was working for slightly above minimum wage at a gas station and having a family, and their amazing interest rates were so fucking high that after I was done paying off the car, I would have been paying $45,000 for what was a $15,000 car. Turns out my co-workers would have both gotten a free payment on their loans for recommending me, and both were really struggling because of their deals at Drive Time, so they kinda tried to sell me out. Thankfully my dad showed up and stopped me and told me he'd help me get a car from my sister's father-in-law. He's a great man for many reasons, but one of them is how he's never given up on me. In truth I'd be lost without my parents' moral, don't get a car from Drive Time, they'll try and fuck you in the butt, raw dog. Musician here. I've had a few contracts pushed across the table toward me on various occasions. My band at the time had garnered the attention of management team that had managed other artists in the region. As it always seems to go, these guys promise you the world and put stars in your eyes. They tell you all about their connections and how they can get you on so and so's radar and do all this other stuff to help further your career. I've been through the whole song and dance before and had some shitty experiences. Therefore, I took this with a grain of salt. After a couple meetings and some back and forth, the management team produced a contract. I did what any smart individual in this situation would do. Don't jump. I also have a friend who's a lawyer. While I don't remember the exact details of the contract, my lawyer friend looked it over and basically told me that it was bad news. This management team was essentially going to be faking us in some sort of fashion in several areas. His advice was to renegotiate or walk away from it. We ended up walking away from it, but we were glad that my lawyer friend looked it over for us first and pointed out the several red flags. The music business can be a dicey place with a lot of sharks. Found out I need a crown. My dentist gives me a line about we only use porcelain crowns because lead is in metal crowns. Okay, but that's the very back tooth and an extra $300 charge. So I went looking for a dentist who would do my crown for cheaper. I have seen these commercials for Abbey Dental where they claim a low price guarantee. They've got a jingle and everything. So I call them up and ask specifically, do you take my type of dental insurance? Lady on the phone says yes they do. I say great and make an appointment. The day before I'm supposed to go, I remember that rays are best in small doses, so I decide to call my first dentist and ask for my recent rays so I can show them to the new place. They give me some rune around, so I call Abbey Dental to check if they even need them. Lady on the phone says no and claims that freshest rays would be included in the second opinion appointment. Cut to the date of the appointment. I get there and they only ask me for my ID, but the girl at the desk says she doesn't need my dental insurance card. I read the full page contract that they give me and it says that they do not take anyone's insurance at all. Full stop. Point. It is definitely my responsibility to bring my old x-rays, otherwise there is a $250 fee. Point. Our low price guarantee is based on the idea that you'll pay us in full, in cash, and then hope for reimbursement from your dental insurance carrier. Even though it doesn't actually work like that, I did not sign shady sheet. I left. And now I get extra mad anytime I see their commercial on TV. The last lease I signed at our apartment complex was either an 8-month, $1,700/month, or 10-month, $1,800/month. They weren't offering a year-long lease, no idea why. We had already lived at the complex for 3 years and had upgraded from a smaller apartment into this current one the previous year. I knew we would most likely be buying a house, which we did, the following year, so it was a matter of trying to determine what lease we wanted. The apartment ownership was notorious for trying to get 15-20% increases in rent every year, based on their supposed complex upgrades. This was also relatively close to an airbase, so they knew they could get the money one way or another. I knew from our previous leases that management was always late sending out their 30-day notice of rent increase/lease offer. I also knew that if the increase was above 10% of the previous year's average, they were required to give us a 60-day notice. Our old contract, which we were able to keep and update each year, had a clause in it that rent would only increase by $50 if we went month to month after the lease ended. We ended up signing the 8-month lease extension. With 30 days left on our contract, they placed a notice on our door detailing a rent increase with either a new signed lease or what the month-to-month cost would be. We never received the door notice. We did receive a notice in the mail 2 weeks later, date stamped for the day before we received it. Fortunately for us, that's the date that matters. The new lease offered price was 10%, $1,870, above our current rent, $1,700. The month-to-month price was $2,250. What they didn't calculate was that with the 8-month lease, they needed to also add the last 4 months of the previous lease, same apartment, to get our year average. This put their ask above the 10% threshold and require a 60-day notice. I notified the apartment manager of the error, stated we should have received a 60-day notice and that we only received a 14-day notice, and that according to our contract, our month-to-month price should only be $1,750. I was half expecting a month rent at $1,750 and a second month's rent split between $1,750 and the $2,250 in their paperwork. I assumed that would have been legally acceptable. The manager responded with, "A lawyer will be contacting you." So I responded by handing them my lawyer's information and told them to contact him instead. 2 weeks go by and I hear nothing. My lawyer also heard nothing. He tells me to pay the $1,750 per the previous contract. When I give them the check, they give me a new 60-day notice of rent/lease increase. By giving me the new notice, I no longer was required to pay a prorated second month of $2,000 and was only required to pay the $1,750. By this time we had an offer out on a house and got out of there before the rent skyrocketed. I also saved $900 in those 10 months signing the 8-month lease over the 10-month lease. Still no idea why they priced it that way. I was recruited by a maker of a kind of software called an ETL tool. ETL is how you can get data from one database to another. It stands for extract, transform, load. Get the data out, change it so it suits the destination it's going to, then load it into there. There are other ways of going about it, but this is a fairly popular data integration methodology. The company was called Ab Initio, and they made some smashingly great ETL software. Probably the best I've ever worked with. I got really good with it, even to the point of picking it apart and getting into the guts of it and finding ways of improving it. That, and some strong ties with people in the company, made me think I might want to work for them directly. So I applied, and my contacts highly recommended me, and they made me a very generous offer. But then the fine print. I would basically have to sign my life away. To work for Ab Initio, I had to agree to not work with Ab Initio for 4 years after I left them. 4 faking years. When consulting rates for Ab Initio experts were in the $125/HR back in the early 2000s. Fact that I wasn't going to sign away the ability to work in my own damn field just to have an employer who provided free lunches and snacks lies in the break room. I respectfully declined and was politely frank about the reason why. They were very understanding about it, and there were no hard feelings. Bit late to the party, but when I was in high school, maybe 9th/10th grade, and at the sign up festival that was hosted for parents to come and sign all the paperwork and buy your child's books, my mom was given a new piece of paper that she hadn't gotten before. It was a liability waiver, basically saying if something goes wrong you can't sue us, even if it's our fault, and you can't contact the press. The year before there was a huge anti-gay riot day that some bad eggs hosted, a red shirt day. Any kid wearing any sort of red was sent home and punished by the school for bullying. Some kids told the newspapers in the area about the bullying, and it blew up, and the school looked like shit. My mom was like, so if your bus driver is drunk and crashes and kills my daughter, I can't get any sort of justice? Or if you miscount on a field trip and leave her behind? And the assistant principal was like, that's very extreme circumstances. My mom said hell no, and ended up telling all the parents there to read it, and explained. She gave some really harsh examples, probably some that weren't really covered by that agreement, and a lot of the parents refused to sign it. That meant the kid couldn't go to school till it was signed. My mom worked as an ad designer for the local newspaper and said she would be seeing if anyone in the newspaper company would be interested in writing an article. The principal freaked and was like, no press, I'll change it, and initialed and changed the agreement. I mean, in the end anyone who didn't have that agreement signed couldn't go on any field trips or leave the school during the day. But when 10th grade has less than 90 students and half of them aren't allowed to go on field trips and have to be supervised at school, the district ends up paying a lot more money on subs to watch 45 kids throughout the day. Principal was later fired for similar reasons. He didn't do a very good job at covering the schools, as if anyone gives a shit the red shirt day article is here.